Hello everyone, this is part 3 of my video series on the history of Christian theology. I am, as always, your host, David the Real Med White, and today we're going to be talking about mainly Christianity's war against Neoplatonism, against Hellenism overall, and we will be destroying a popular misconception of various different supposed scholars who claim that Christianity is Neoplatonic, right? Christianity is Hellenistic philosophy, whereas our thesis is going to be different. We are going to be saying that the only relation Christianity has with Neoplatonism is, as a matter of fact, via heresy and heretics. And two really important characters are going to be personifying this notion. It's going to be Origen and Arius. These two people are the physical embodiments of the synthesis between Hellenism and Christianity. And for this video, we're going to be taking a look at 4 main topics. We're going to be looking at the Logos, Theology, and Apologists, the early apologists who tried to prove the deity of Christ, that tried to prove the Trinity, defended the doctrine of the Trinity. Then we're going to be looking at Origen and his beliefs, and kind of like a review of what Neoplatonism itself is. And then we're going to be, before we look at the Arian Christ, we're going to do kind of a review of the historiographical understanding between the two Europes, because this is going to be pretty important for this video, how first Europe views things and how second Europe views things. And saying that term, I just remembered, if you haven't watched part 1 and part 2, I will recommend you go check them out. Both are really good videos. Both are edifying, I think. Many people seem to say that as well. So this is what we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be starting with Logos Theology and its apologists. But before we do that, it's kind of, again, important to preview it with how Second Europe, how the modern understanding of looking at the past, looking at the early church, and how it poisons our way of thinking. So many people think that Hellenism and Christianity was in a synthesis. It was in an age of synthesis, and later on with the council, it fully synthesized. Christianity synthesized its doctrines with Hellenism. That's kind of like the modern, popular understanding of how Christian theology developed. This is a strange understanding. It's, for example, they use this as a reason to explain the complexity of Christian theology. Many scholars, when they look at it, many scholars are, they have atheistic presuppositions, and when they see the complexity and the consistency of the Christian worldview, many of them say, oh, well, it's complex, but religion cannot be complex. And I'm not kidding, but this is the kind of view that a lot of people, a lot of secular scholars have. So in order to explain that, they say, well, it cannot be complex. So really, its complexity comes from secular philosophy. It must be. And again, we need to understand that Second Europe, as I said in part 1, have its views via rediscovering and making use of Aristotle. People in First Europe, people that lived at that time, knew of Aristotle. Many church fathers, many academicians in the 4th, 5th century, and so on, what did they do? They studied Aristotle, they studied Plato. Many of these people already knew these people. They knew their philosophy. They were aware of their philosophy. Whereas the West wasn't aware of their philosophy for a very long time. The understanding of Catholic is universality, contra the original view, which is the wholeness of the faith, as we said in part 2. In order for the faith to be universal, Christianity had to adopt Hellenism. But wait a second. It doesn't only have to do that, according to various second European historiographical people. This can be Roman Catholics, this can be Protestants, this can be seculars. Many people think that Christianity needs to adapt to the culture that it's in rather than the other way around. It's culture that has to adapt to Christianity and deify itself. It's not Christianity that has to make itself easier, right, more common to man. That is a bastardization of the faith. And in the second European understanding, the top men in Christianity are not the bishops, not theologians, not priests, but it's merely these secular scholars and historians. That's why today in the West, when we look at what a father thinks, we don't listen to the theologians, we just go to people who are in the camp of Bart Ehrman. Many people do that, right? They just go to Bart Ehrman's camp or any other atheist supposed scholars' opinion, but they don't listen to the theologians. They don't listen to the bishops. They don't listen to the priests, who has a better insight because they share the spiritual, let's say, heritage with those fathers. And so this is very important to have in mind, because our analysis of the Arian crisis and what happened before the Arian crisis, especially with Origen, is going to be very important to this, because a lot of the understanding of these characters stem from that, right? So let's move on to the Logos theologians. There are four main Logos theologians that we're going to be looking at: Saint Aristides of Athens, Saint Athenagoras, Saint Theophilus, and Saint Justin Martyr, very popular saint. All of these are saints in the Orthodox Church. Let's talk about what Logos theology is first. Well, their main target audience were Jews, pagans, and Gnostics, right? And other groups of heretics, right? Gnosticism, as we've seen in part 2, has different subgroups. And one of their apologetic was to connect the Old Testament with the New. So their presupposition was that the New Testament is a continuation of the Old Testament. And one of the arguments of Saint Justin Martyr is that the Logos, who we know as Jesus Christ, was an angel of the Lord in the Old Testament. This is the argument he used against Trypho the Jew. You can read this in his apology against Trypho the Jew. And the basic idea of Logos theology is to defend the deity of the Christ, defend the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity. So it's not some new development that happened 3 centuries, 4 centuries after, as many seculars or even Muslims loathe to claim. But as a matter of fact, this was the Christian dogma from the beginning. So the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity, was already Christian dogma. Many of these Logos theologians, by the way, are 2nd century figures, right? They're 2nd century figures. Most of them. They were very early. They were very early in expounding this dogma. And they also, again, who is the Logos? It's Jesus Christ, right? So Christ is the mediator between God and man. And so we know God the Father through Christ. Now, this is an important point because many of these Logos theologians formulate this in philosophical terms. And while they do it successfully, we will see later on that while it is indeed successful, mostly, at times there are question marks that are raised because there are certain sections where they didn't clarify things enough. And this kind of, you could argue, led to Arian crisis in some ways. However, we should also note again that the fathers themselves, the Logos theologians themselves, will reject the conclusions that people like Arius or Origen came to, right? However, this is why it's very important to be precise in theology, and that theology is not merely just an intellectual exercise, because it can lead to these problems. And so there's a very valuable lesson to learn here, I think. An implicit claim, especially St. Justin Martyr makes, that we are going to be looking at further, is that the good parts of Hellenic philosophy is actually from Hebrew biblical theology. So St. Justin Martyr's argument against the Hellenists is essentially all these good ideas that you have, it's because you captured some parts of the true faith, some parts of the Christian faith, but you don't have the wholeness. You don't have the wholeness. We have the wholeness of the Christian faith. And that was one of his apologetics against the Hellenists. So let's start with St. Aristides of Athens. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but the basic idea is that St. Aristides kind of, let's say, borrowed the Stoic theme of God being the creator, the sustainer of the cosmos, although he wasn't supporting a Stoic sort of understanding. He tried to basically say, this is, your superintending Logos, this you Stoics have, that's Christ, that's God. So that was kind of his argument. And Farrell himself notes, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but he notes basically the lack of clarification could have led to contradictions that I think that St. Aristides himself will reject. The other Logos theologian is St. Athenagoras of Athens. His argument is analogy of being. Now, this is a term that is relevant in theological disputes today. However, St. Athenagoras' analogia entis is something that is quite different from the later medieval second European theologians' understanding of analogia entis, because Saint Athenagoras' argument against the Hellenists and the Gnostics was essentially this: well, there seems to be this one, right? This world operates under the creation operates under one set of principles, isn't it? Because natural laws apply here, and in other places it applies the same, right? So there seems to be only one principle. And his opponents will say, yes, you seem to be correct, Mr. Athenagoras. And Saint Athenagoras will argue, well, seeing that is the case, then there can only be one God, because there's only one principle. If there are many gods, then there will be many operating principles. And this will be his argument against many of the pagans, many of the Neoplatonists, who believe that there are multiple mediating principles in this world. And so it's quite a different argument that Saint Athenagoras is using here, and that we ourselves will, yes, I mean, it will be one of the arguments that, for example, I will use if I debated against a polytheist, although not many polytheists exist today, but if I debated against a polytheist, that's one of the arguments that I will be using. I mean, if there are many gods, then there needs to be many operating principles, but that doesn't seem to be the case now, does it? Of course, there's many other arguments that we can use, but this is not a bad argument. So Saint Athenagoras, he says, first of all, this quote is very good because he says the world is spherical. The world is spherical. And don't you see, it's kind of funny because when you see like secular historians, they look at the 15th century and they look at the Roman Catholic Church and their disputes with Galileo Galilei. Now, I don't really care about Galileo. I don't really care about that whole dispute. But what I care about is that many people look at that dispute and they say, oh, the church at the time, they didn't even know the earth was round. They believed the earth was flat, bro. Like, you had all of these anti-Christian atheists attacking, and then here you have like an early church father that just matter-of-factly says, oh, by the way, the earth is a sphere. Like, he says it matter-of-factly. He doesn't even feel the need to prove his own case. Just say, oh, by the way, the world is a sphere. We're on the same page, right? I mean, I think that's kind of funny. Many people don't really know that the church fathers were a lot more intelligent than what they think they are. So he says that, again, this is the argument of analogia entis. He is saying that the creator of the world is above things created, managing it by his providential care of these. What place is there for the second God or for the other gods, right? If there's only one mediating principle, why do we need other gods that are subordinate to the one true God? That doesn't make any sense, says Saint Athenagoras. Now, some might say, well, this runs with odds against the Trinity, but reminder, Saint Athenagoras is arguing for the Trinity, as we see here. He says, from the beginning, God, who is the eternal mind, nous, had the Logos in himself, Logos being Christ, being from eternity instinct with the Logos, but as inasmuch as he came forth to be the idea and energizing power of all material things, which lay like a nature without attributes and an inactive earth, the grosser particles being mixed up with the lighter, the prophetic spirit also agrees for his statements. The Lord, it says, made me the beginning of his ways to his works. So, again, Athenagoras clearly implies the deity and eternity of the Logos. So he does intend to confess the Trinity, but there is something where there needs to be some clarification here. And again, this is something I will argue that St. Athenagoras will agree with us. However, this leads to question, is the Logos an energy that became hypostatized, or was it a person, right? So when does he get his personality, right? Is it at the beginning? Is it before time? So this is something that was left open, and as I'm saying, Saint Athenagoras himself will say, oh, Christ is before time. He was always a person, right? But again, this is something that at the time was something that lacked clarification. So again, we're not counter-signaling the church fathers. We're not saying, oh, they're bad arguments. They made bad arguments. But it kind of shows that even the slightest opening that you give to heretics is going to be used eventually. And so this is a very important historical lesson for us, that we shouldn't give heretics an inch. Saint Theophilos of Antioch is the first recorded church father who uses the term Trinity. So he distinguishes between logos in God's mind and logos that is emitted. And this runs into the same question as you've asked before. He says the word always exists, residing within the hearts of God, for before anything came into being, he had him as counselor, being his own mind and thought. But when God wished to make all that he determined on, he begot his word, uttered the firstborn of all creation, not himself being emptied of the word, right? So he didn't lose wisdom, but having begotten reason, and always conversing with reason. So God didn't lose his reason by begetting reason. And this leads to the same questions that we've asked. I mean, is the word eternal, right? The word is eternal, but is his personality eternal? I mean, right? These are questions that, again, were needed to be answered. So, finally, the most popular Logos theologian is Saint Justin Martyr. And Saint Justin Martyr says that it can be proved from divine prophecies that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the founder of the Christian religion. He founded it according to God's will in order to transform and repair mankind. The demons imitated and aped the prophecies of the Old Testament in the pagan mystery cults. This explains many similarities and resemblances between the Christian religion and pagan forms of worship. So I believe this is Quasan actually, sorry, not Justin Martyr, but this is his explanation of how there can be some sort of similarity between different religions, because they all came from the one true religion and are deviations of the one true religion. So St. Justin Martyr is arguing that Christianity is a perennial religion, but Christianity is not a perennialist religion. This is a very important distinction to make. And Johannes Quasten says, similarly, philosophers like Plato borrowed from the Old Testament. For this reason, we cannot be surprised to find Christian ideas in Platonism, right? And so this understanding is, again, very important, because the second European understanding of things, even by its religious people, they look at the past and they look at what St. Justin Martyr says and say, this can't be true. I mean, they don't, because many of them assume that Christianity is not true, or their starting point is that Christianity needs to be proven by my standards, right? By my empirical XYZ standards. And so this understanding and looking at the fathers, again, leads to various different issues. The premises of St. Justin Martyr is that God is unoriginate, and he's the preeminent creator of all. He, by definition, is utterly transcendent. This is in his dialogue with Trypho. And the Logos is the gap between creation and the Father. Let me, hold on, look at them. Yeah. So, one important thing to note here, this is another question that needs to be asked in St. Justin's system. If God the Father is utterly transcendent, right, and the Logos is the gap between creation and the Father, well, it doesn't seem to be that the Logos is utterly transcendent. And so, utter transcendence seems to be the distinguishing attribute of either divinity or of the person of God the Father. Now, again, this is something that wasn't really clear at St. Justin's time, and this is why later on with the Cappadocian theologians, you see this whole being covered by the Cappadocian fathers. But as I've mentioned many times before with the other Logos theologians, I believe St. Justin Martyr himself will reject the subordinationist implication of this question, and he will say, no, this is absolutely not true. If he managed to make his understanding more clear. And it's also important to realize that these fathers, these Logos theologians, were the first wave of Trinitarian apologists. They were the first wave of the Trinitarian apologists after the apostles. So, of course, I mean, the fact that the supposed inconsistencies are so few in their system is itself a miracle, I will say. Because it's really not easy to defend the faith wholesale, defend the doctrine of the Trinity wholesale in such explicit detail, in such a great way. So again, when we look at the fathers and we look at these question marks, this is not an attack on the fathers, but as a matter of fact, it's an appraisal of the fathers in a sense, and it's a correction of the possible wrong implications. And this has happened through Christian history. This is not something new. This has happened through Christian history, especially with the Chalcedonian controversy. This will become incredibly clear that later developments will indeed cover the holes. And when we speak of developments, I want to make note that I'm not referring to doctrinal development, because that's heretical. Doctrine doesn't develop, it doesn't metastasize, it doesn't change form. However, our understanding of the doctrine develops, right? So it's kind of like a doctrinal precision develops, but not the doctrine itself. Saint Justin Martyr on secular philosophy and its relationship with Logos. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the basic idea is that Saint Justin Martyr is arguing that, well, there are some questions that people have. Well, how can Christianity in some regards be so similar with these other philosophies? And Saint Justin Martyr says, well, yes, because these philosophies got some level of Logos, some understanding of the Logos, but they never had the fullness of the faith. But they never got the fullness of the revelation. The fullness of the revelation is in the Old Testament scriptures, and now it's in the New Testament, now it's in the life of Christ. And therefore, we possess the fullness of the faith. Now, also, I want to note, the New Testament, there are different New Testaments at the time, right? So there wasn't a set King James Bible, New Testament, King James Bible, 17th century. There wasn't any of that. There wasn't any of that. There are multiple different New Testament canons, but the basic idea is the New Covenant, right? The fullness of the faith is in the Christian religion. And these other philosophies got some parts of that. And that is why our ideas at some points are similar. But at many other crucial points, it's not at all similar. And I see this with people. I had this debate with my friend. I mean, he kind of argued that all religions are the same. They all have and he emphasizes the similar points about each religion, and that's fine. But just as much as there are similar points in each religion, there's also points that are not similar at all. And you can say that with all philosophies have common points, but at the same time, they have points that differentiate them. It's the points that differentiate them is how we can distinguish other religions. So this kind of understanding, I see this with people a lot. I think it's really stupid. I don't really mean to be mean. I don't really mean to make fun of people, but I think it's really stupid. And once people kind of mull over it, they will themselves understand, it doesn't really make any sense. So let's move on. I believe my PowerPoint slide is frozen. Oh, no, it's not. It's fine now. Now, if you watched Jay Dyer, great content, you most likely heard of the Origenist problematic. Now, if you haven't heard of the Origenist problematic, we're going to get to that later. We're going to get to the Origenist problematic later. But this debate with Tertullian, we're kind of going to tease it out a little bit. We're going to kind of tease it out a little bit. Because this is, again, many of the heresies that developed is they didn't happen out of the blue, right? They didn't just, it just happened. What can we do? But rather that this impulse was present in many of the other church figures, such as Tertullian. Now, Tertullian's debate with Hermogenes is that Hermogenes argued that creation was eternal because God was always God, and because he was God, he was always Lord. But to be Lord, he has to have something to be Lord over, right? This is very much the Origenist problematic. And in order to be Lord over something, creation has to be eternal. And the Origenist problematic in this will be that because of this, God did not create freely. Therefore, God does not have free will because creation was necessity, right? It was a necessary thing for God to do. This will be the Origenist problematic. So Hermogenes was basically, he was kind of arguing that, right? Matter always existed because God is always Lord, and God has to be Lord over something that always exists. Tertullian's answer is illuminating. He's trying to defend the traditional doctrine of the creation of the world. But notice what he does. He says that we maintain that he always has the title of God, but he doesn't always have the title of Lord, because the nature of those titles is different. God is the title of the substance, the divine nature. Lord is the title of power. He became Lord and acquired that name from time when things came into being over which the power of the Lord was exercised. The position and the title come to a cession of power. God is Father and Judge, but this is very key, but it does not follow that he's Father and Judge eternally, because he is always God. He could not be a father before he had a son, nor judge before sin was committed. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, the problem is that the issue is, how can one maintain eternal fatherhood without maintaining the eternality of the word? This is really the whole debate, what the whole debate is about. And Tertullian's mistake is that he's fusioning some of the aspects. So he's basically saying, again, God was not always father, right? To be father, he has to have a son. The problem is I think it's kind of obvious. It implies that the son is not eternal, and it implies subordinationism, which is basically Arianism, right? So at the time, a lot of the theologians were battling and commenting about this notion, right? God the Father is the sole cause. He's the sole cause of creation, but also of the persons. But Hermogenes says, well, that means creation is eternal, so the Son is also eternal. And Tertullian says, no, creation is not eternal. So fatherhood is not eternal, but then the Son is also not eternal, ? And again, these are perennial questions that were needed to be answered, that developed into the Arian crisis. But before we even move on to that, let's talk a little bit about Origenism. Now, Origen was born in the 2nd century, 184, 185. His father is a saint. He's a martyr, Saint Leonidas of Alexandria. And Origen himself, before his father was martyred, he wanted to be martyred at a young age, but he was prevented by his mother. So imagine what will happen if he actually got martyred. Maybe Origen will be a saint, but he's not a saint. And if you question that, if you're Orthodox or if you're Roman Catholic and you accept the ecumenical councils and you want to defend that Origen is a saint, then I will recommend you to check out the Fifth Ecumenical Council. This is an aside, but the Fifth Ecumenical Council, it's something that people have debated about. What's really interesting is that if you're Roman Catholic and if you want to defend Origen, Hefele actually notes that Hefele actually refutes the argument that Origen's name was added in the list of heretics afterwards. He actually refutes that. So that's very interesting. Hefele is a Roman Catholic historian. It's worth checking out. But that's a different topic. Origen emasculated himself at the age of 18. The evidence of that is Eusebius. I believe Eusebius was also a fan of Origen. So this being a lie, like an anti-Origenist lie, is again very unlikely. And he was excommunicated because of that. So he was excommunicated after he became a priest because he was a eunuch. And eunuchs were canonically not allowed to be priests. So a random canonical fact there. He attended the lectures of Ammonius Saccas, who is a Neoplatonist who influenced Plotinus. Now there's a huge debate that goes on even today whether Ammonius Saccas was a Christian or not. Many of the church fathers, Saint Jerome, Eusebius of Caesarea, believed that he was a Christian, but many of the supposed scholars claim that he was odd. They're actually defending Ammonius of Alexandria. Now, I don't really buy that. Porphyry claimed that Ammonius Saccas apostatized, and the scholars claimed that they misunderstood him, and they defended another Ammonius, which again, I don't think it really follows. And I think the reason why people claim that Ammonius was never a Christian or apostatized and stopped being a Christian, well, the implication will be pretty severe. The implication will be that Neoplatonism came from Christianity, not the other way around. And I will say that this is a very inconvenient fact for many of the second European secular historiographical persons. Historiographists, I think that's the term is. I don't know. So it's just a food for thought. I believe Ammonius was a Christian, just because him being a Christian will basically be very inconvenient for Christ-hating people. So why not? I'll believe Ammonius is a Christian, and I believe that our saints defended that he was a Christian. Now, the Neoplatonism of Origen, is that he says in his first principles that among all intellectual, that is incorporeal things, What is there so universally surpassing, so unspeakably and immeasurably excelling as God, whose nature, certainly the human mind, however pure or clear to the very utmost that mind may be, cannot gaze at or behold? So apophaticism here. God therefore must not be taught to be any kind of body or to exist in a body, but to be a simple intellectual existence. Simple intellectual existence, question mark here, admitting in himself of no addition whatever, so that he cannot be believed to have in himself a more or less, but is unity, or if I may say oneness throughout, and a mind and fount from which originates all intellectual existence or mind. So one key to note here is that he has an emphasis on oneness. Now, the oneness of Origen Neoplatonism is very important that we explain. The one is unity throughout in Origen's system and in Neoplatonism. So that's the key assumption, right? And there's that distinctions are oppositions, necessarily are oppositions. So being is distinct from non-being, they're opposed to each other. One is distinct from many, they're opposed to each other. Good, evil, distinct, are opposed to each other. Spirit and matter, they're opposed to each other. The one is beyond being, so it's entirely apophatic, and the one is unity throughout. So that means that there's a Neoplatonic simplicity that we're talking about here, or as J. Dyer notes, absolute divine simplicity, right? Neoplatonic simplicity, absolute divine simplicity, they're basically the same thing. And one important thing to note out here is that the Ordo Theology completely goes out the window, because essence, energy, person, will, mind, they're all the same thing. They all mean essence. And this is a key factor of Origen's understanding of simplicity that will be tackled in the Arian controversy. There's a Neoplatonist Trinity. There is the one, right? Simplicity throughout. There is his first creation. There's his first deity, second deity, nous. Third deity, the world soul. And they were all right. The mind or nous is subordinate to the one because it was caused by it, while the one is uncaused. The world soul being the knowledge produced by the mind knowing itself, the mind knows itself, right, is produced by the mind and is therefore subordinate to it, right? So world soul is subordinate to the nous is subordinate to the one. There is no free will in the one. For the one to exist, it has to be many. There has to be many. So the many has free will, but the one does not have free will. So this is the Origenist problem, right? Origenist problem for the one to be one, right? For God to be, and this is an argument used against Roman Catholics all the time, and it's an accurate argument. If we believe in a Neoplatonic doctrine of simplicity, right, absolute divine simplicity, where all of these categories were equated to the essence and there were no distinctions because distinctions in Godhead created oppositions, well, that will give us reason to believe that for the one to be one, there needs to be many, right? For God to be God and for God to be Lord, there needs to be creation. But then for him to have that attribute eternally, creation has to be eternal. But if creation has to be eternal, then God cannot freely create. Because in order to secure his own existence, he has to do it. So he cannot have free will. But the many has free will. And so this is the Origenist problem that the Roman Catholic dogma still is weak towards today. And many other religions are weak against this dogma. But there's also another question. If the acts of the one are its essence, then the many cannot be essentially distinct because the many are the acts of the one. But that means the many are also the one. So there is not really a distinction between the one and the many. The one, the many is basically the one and the many and the many. It's the same thing. It's kind of like an argument that Severus of Antioch used against Julian of Halicarnassus, who denied that Christ had properties, right? He denied the humanity and that the humanity and the divinity were distinct. He said that they were distinct but not distinct. So Severus basically, okay, then that means if they're distinct but not distinct, then Christ is in his humanity consubstantial with God and his divinity consubstantial with us. I mean, and he said, this is stupid. You're like, you're stupid. So it kind of is the same thing, right? It's the kind of same principle. The many are the many are the one. It's kind of like the same thing. And it entails, again, pantheism. So let's understand the implications of the Neoplatonic system, which is also Origen's system. Again, Neoplatonic system, Origen system, they're basically the same thing. On the first principles many church fathers read, is they said this is basically Neoplatonism. The devaluing of metaphysical categorical symbols by reduction to absolute identity in the form of the names of God, of the essence, will, and operations, energies of God, and therefore a system where God is effectively denied free choice, and free choice is defined in terms of moral oppositions which exist between all choices absolutely. So, morality, every choice you make is either good or evil. Right? There's no middle. There's a tendency to produce a threefold subordinationalism of basic constituents, a tendency to reduce constituents to absolute unity, a tendency to multiply constituents ad infinitum, right? The many are the ad infinitum, a definition of the unity of God in positive terms entailing all the above, a definition of the unity of God in impersonal terms, and it's a system where abstract impersonal unity transcends personal multiplicity in its emphasis. Right? So this is directly at odds with the doctrine of the Trinity. But many people, when they look at the Neoplatonist Trinity, they say, oh, look, Neoplatonism has a Trinity, or Christianity has a Trinity, so it must mean the same thing. Sorry, but the Neoplatonic Trinity is directly at odds with Christian dogma. It's directly at odds. The impersonal God of Origen is important to note. Sorry, but I need to get a water drinking break. I could cut this part out, but I'd rather prefer this to be one take. Origen's impersonal God. Now, throughout this text, I don't really plan on reading it, but he speaks of God. So at times, he speaks of God as a him. But at times, he speaks of God as an it. So he says here that simple and holy mental existence can admit not delay or hesitation in any of its movements or operations. For if it did so, the simplicity of its divine nature will appear to be limited and impeded by such an addition. Right? And this is exactly what we're talking about, right? It's basically saying there cannot be distinctions in this oneness. It's impossible. Now, as one cannot be a father apart from having a son, nor a lord apart from holding a possession or a slave, so we cannot call God Almighty if there are none over whom he can exercise his power. So this is his justification to believe that creation is eternal. Accordingly, to prove God is Almighty, we must assume the existence of the universe. For if anyone will have it that certain ages or periods of time, or whatever he cares to call them, elapsed during which the present creation did not exist, he will undoubtedly prove that in those ages or periods God was not Almighty, but that he afterwards became Almighty from the time when he began to have creatures over whom he could exercise power. But if there was no time when he was not Almighty, there must always have existed the things in virtue of which he was Almighty. Right? So creation has to be eternal for God to have his attributes. If God doesn't have these attributes, then God is not simple. Therefore, God doesn't exist. So creation has to be eternal, says Origen. And again, here you say the eternality of all of this. The summary of Origen's system is that there is one simple deity. That simple deity is simple in its Neoplatonic sense. And because of this simplicity, there's no distinctions. No distinctions in the Godhead. Therefore, creatorhood equals fatherhood. To be father is to be a creator. Predestination is foreknowledge. Justice is mercy. The operation of God, one of the operations, which is really the essence, is being Almighty. The creation must be eternal for God to have his eternal operation, because his operation is the essence. and the persons are thus operations as well in Origen's system. This is also an aside, but Origen believed that the souls pre-existed, and his defense was that, well, some babies are born blind, right? Some babies are born with defects, and how can God be just if the souls don't pre-exist and they're just born that way? And so, in order for God to be just, souls have to pre-exist, and those souls must have sinned before they came into being. The Origenist doctrine of creation is that there is a hierarchy of beings in order to explain evil, because in Origen's system, the fall in the garden was an introduction of the many in that sense, because there's a multiplicity of rational beings, and multiplicity is a decline from unity, and that's evil, right? But as we mentioned before, the pre-existence of soul, that kind of implies God is the author of evil, because the sins existed before the souls. And so the acts of God outside himself are of moral lapses. There is an eternal fall because creation is mutable, and free will is a dialectical choice between good and evil. So in the eschaton we have free will, but if free will is dialectically defined as a choice between good and evil, well, that stands to reason that you can fall again, right? That's a doctrine that is needed to be avoided. But this is the logic he came to that conclusion with, right? So you see, these are all anti-Christian doctrines, but you see the logical steps where he comes to that, right? They all follow with each other. So theology is not some one thing that you focus on and everything is just like that. Like these systems have to be coherent with one another. This, by the way, also refutes fideism. I had to deal with fideistic friends that really will not shut the heck up about fideism. This whole thing that the church, Origen did this, but all the church fathers also did this. They also cared about being consistent. And I can see how that is not at odds with fideism. Anyways, we are now at reviewing the historiographical understanding between two Europes. So now let's get at that. For the Second European theological historiography, Christianity is hand in hand with secular philosophy. And there's a quote from Johannes Quasten. He thinks that the Christianity is an assimilation of secular learning and education. And so all these church fathers, they assimilated secular learning, says Quasten. Right? Really? And what is his conclusion? Well, there's a new Christian humanism born. But wait a second. How does he come to Christian humanism? Oh, well, that's very obvious, because in the Renaissance, well, there was a Christian humanism, right? A rebirth. So Second Europe wants to basically feel relevant to the Christianity of the 5th and 4th century. And in order to do that, they applied the terms and they applied the novel understandings of their age, and they applied to that time. Sorry, but that doesn't make any sense. There is no Christian humanism in the 5th or 4th century. I'm sorry, but that's not the case. That's a Renaissance invention. I might be wrong that it's a Renaissance invention, but it's an invention at that time frame. And of course, it could even come from the Byzantines themselves, Romans themselves. Religion is a tool for the emperors, so the idea of the emperors genuinely converting to a religious faith out of notwithstanding pragmatical reasons is completely foreign to these people. Quasten claims, for example, that monasticism is a developed political response from the church to combat possible moral degradation of the new converts. How stupid is this? This is the stupidest thing I've ever read. Monasticism is a political response against moral degradation? No, monasticism is even in the Old Testament, idiot. I'm sorry, but this is so stupid. Asceticism, monasticism, already exist in the Old Testament. Saint John the Baptist, guess what? He was an ascetic. So it's not a new moral response. And there is this idea in Quaston that there are theological schools, and these theological schools are rivals with one another. And he says here, this is very long, but the basic idea is that he says that the school of Alexandria, it reached its peak under Origen. So there's already a school of Alexandria. Do fathers talk about the school of Alexandria? I've never seen a father talk about this kind of like an understanding. And following the main impulses of its masters, the response was from the Neo-Alexandrian school by Saint Athanasius. And it is comparing it with the school of Antioch. So now, wait a second, there's another school now? There's like 2 schools now. Not 3, because there's a Neo-Alexandrian school. But we don't see this even talked about in the Fathers. And the leader of this new school was Saint Athanasius, the defender of the faith against Arius. And the most brilliant disciples of the school of Neo-Alexandrian school is Eusebius, the Cappadocians, Didymus the blind, and then suddenly Kirill is this like Neo-Alexandria school, and he's like fighting against the head of the school of Antioch, who's Nestorius. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. This is absolute nonsense. This is not how debates between people is not a result of rivalries between 2 schools. That's a new invention. And we see this even with theologians today. Sorry, but that's a new invention, right? Maybe there might be theological understandings that depend on that region, right? Alexandria might have its own way of expressing the faith, and Antioch may have its own way. But these are not contradictory theological schools. What is in contrast is that the debates are between theological systems, not schools, not just a rivalry, not a secular, stupid rivalry. Now let's look at Second European secular assumptions. The traditions and stories, lives of the saints, right? The miracles, they're all assumed to be fake. They're all assumed to be wrong. And all of those stories are assumed to just be stories to control people, right? Christianity is like all religions. They just use mythology to decorate the stories of the lives of the saints. And their justification, they even outline more attacks. They say, well, there's a lack of detail between multiple accounts, right? Or there might be just a lack of multiple accounts overall, and hey, this means that it's false. Now, if we apply that same standard, there's so many other historical figures that we have to give up. I recently seen a video of a guy who's questioning the existence of William Shakespeare, and he uses these same exact arguments. he used the same exact. Oh, we don't have any historical accounts of Shakespeare. We don't have multiple accounts of Shakespeare. And religion is something that is subverted by the political elite. Right? Don't we see this so much by these secular supposed historians? Oh, religion, that's just something that the leaders made up to control its people. It doesn't actually mean anything. It's just and they just made people waste their time, like this neo-Marxist view. And the funny thing is, this Marxist view of looking at history is not even Marxist. It doesn't even come from Marx. It comes from way before Marx, right? It comes from the Enlightenment, way before Marx. So, for example, St. Constantine's progressive conversion is just him tacking Christianity with some pagan flavors. Now, I also want to note, in the Roman Catholic Church, in the Latin Rite, St. Constantine and St. Justin are not saints. Is St. Constantine? I don't think St. Constantine is a canonized saint. He was, but then he got decanonized, as if that's even possible. And now they're saints again, but through the uniates. So now they're saints through uniates. So they were saints, now they're not saints, but suddenly they're saints again. I mean, can the Vatican make its mind, please? I'm sorry, but can they make their own mind? This is not something that we see in the first in in First European Christianity. Now, First European Historiographical view is that the review of history is based on fate. It's based on fate. Or epistemology is primarily based on fate. All epistemology is based on fate. The difference between First Europe and Second Europe in that matter is that the First Europe is honest about it. The Second Europe is not honest about it. They claim to have neutrality. They claim to have objective observance, but that's not the case. There are no theological schools nor rivalries, right? There might be different if you mean by theological schools by different understandings that depend by region, then we don't have any disagreement. But that's not what theological schools mean in Second European historiographical view. What it means is like Thomism and Scotism and all these different, or in Islam. Now, some people might be surprised, but Islam has mezhebs. What are these? They have the Hanafi view, they have the Shafi'i view, Maliki, all of these different schools and traditions. These different distinct traditions that contradict with each other. Sunni Islam is full of those. Okay? So this is an Islamic view. This is a Second European Roman Catholic Protestant view. In Orthodoxy, there is no school. There is no school of Palamism. That doesn't exist. Okay, there's no school of Cyrillianism. That doesn't exist either. If you talk about Cyrillian theology, you just mean the theology that Saint Cyril professed. That's kind of just what it means. What are good examples? I mean, there's no Augustinian school in Orthodoxy. There's no Palamite school. They don't exist. There's only Orthodoxy. There's no different traditions that contradict with each other. So, finally, we have reached to Arianism. Now, for some people, this will be disappointingly short, but I think it will still be instrumental. Before I move on to this section, allow me to drink my water, please. Sorry that I had to take a 10-second break, but we're back. I didn't mean to be sarcastic, but really sorry. So, as always, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the basic idea here is that Arius is basically the arrival of the logical consistency and the logical holes of certain apologists. He is the finalization of it. And as I've said, I'd like to draw this parallel. If Neoplatonism is the enemy of Christianity, Origen will be the synthesis of Neoplatonism and Christianity. Arius will be the logical conclusion of that very synthesis. So let's talk about Arius and what his beliefs were. Well, as we all know, he believed that Christ was not God. He believed that Christ was a deity. Christ was created, sorry. He was a Libyan priest in Alexandria that unfortunately lived for 80 years. For the good of the church, I wish he lived much shorter. He confused nature and person, right? So he equated God with his simplicity, which is being unbegotten, right? So God is unbegotten. Therefore, Christ is begotten, so Christ cannot be God. Right? It's a simple, logical train, you could say. He says the Logos holds a middle place between God and the world. God created him to be instrument of creation. The Holy Spirit is the first of the creatures of the Logos. He is still less than God the Word, right? So notice something that we talked about before. Do you remember? Let's go back a couple slides. Look at the part of Neoplatonist Trinity. You have the One, the Father, Nous, and the world soul. So Christ is the Nous, and the Holy Spirit is the world soul in Arius' system. So do you see this parallel between Arianism and Neoplatonism? I bet they don't talk to you about this, but we do, free of charge. And the order theology of Arius is that he starts from simplicity and unoriginatedness, the thought, will, and Son and Word, right? So there is this order theology of Arius that's different from the Orthodox order of doing theology. What is it? Please try to remember if you've seen part 1 and part 2. We start with person, and then we move on to operations, and energies. And then, finally, essence, right? Person, energy, essence. So it's really important to remember that because it's very instrumental. So, in contrast to Arianism, what is the state of Orthodox Trinitarianism in the age of Arianism? Didymus the Blind proposes the formula that God is one in ousia, three in hypostasis. So one in essence, three in person. The formula of Didymus the Blind. And Didymus's justification on that is very, very interesting. Because he says whatever has the same ousia, whatever has the same essence, must have the same energy. Isn't it kind of funny how Didymus the Blind just matter-of-factly says, expose the doctrine of energies this early on? Well, of course. So there's a traditional ordo theologia, person, energy, essence, that is emphasized in Didymus the Blind. There is also a unitary subject Christology of Saint Athanasius, the Logos theology, and we're going to be looking this especially closely in, I believe, part 6 about the Monophysite crisis, because it's going to be very relevant, because right now both Orthodox and Orientals have this view of Logos Sarx, but it's very different now. But Saint Athanasius' understanding of unitary subject Christology is that Christ is the acting agent in all of his human and divine acts. By the way, Apollinarius was also a proponent of this, but he came to, naturally, wrong conclusions. The person is the self-same Logos who enters the new mode of being, where we can observe the two natures via their respective energies, right? So again, there's a person that has the energies and doing activities. From those activities and their categories, we can ascertain the nature. We don't know the nature and the entirety of the nature, but we know what the nature is. A human energy points to us a human nature. Divine energies point to us a divine nature. And therefore, because there's a unitary subject Christology, that Christ is the Logos in his flesh, the Word was made flesh, John 1:14, the Virgin Mary is the Theotokos. And this is a title that St. Athanasius uses. So St. Athanasius, in his third discourse against the Arians, he outlines the Arian view. The Arian view is that whatever the Father wills, the Son wills also. There's a unity of will in the Trinity. This is very close to the parallel of Nestorianism, where he applies that to Christology. That's another topic for part 5. The Father and the Son are one because their unity is in will. They share the same will. And if the Word is like the Father, this is Saint Athanasius' response. Well, if their oneness comes from the unity of will, then the angels, powers, authorities, thrones, dominions, principalities, sun and moon, the stars, should also all be the same as the Son and the Father, because they all have the same will in Arius' system. And this is one of the powerful arguments that St. Athanasius used, that the unity of will doesn't really follow. But Arius also says that the being of the Word came from the will of the Father, whereas St. Athanasius says the Son came from the nature of the Father. Now we're going to get to that part. But the being of the Word is not by will, and St. Athanasius says it doesn't follow from Scripture. There's no place in Scripture that indicates that the Word came from the will of the Father. And he cites Ptolemy and Valentinian that said that Origen had a pair of attributes, thought and will. And what he is saying here is that Ptolemy and Valentinius, Ptolemy and Valentinus, their mistake was to hypostatize the energies of God and to make the energies person, right? Unbegottenness a person, thought being a person, will being a person. So St. Athanasius' alternative explanation is this: a man by counsel, by will, builds a house, but he by nature begets a son. And so what is in building began to come into being at will and is external to the maker, but the Son is proper offspring of the Father's essence and is not external to him. Wherefore neither does he counsel concerning him, lest he appear to counsel about himself. As far then as the Son transcends the creature, by so much does what is by nature transcend the will. And they, on hearing of him, ought not to measure by will what is by nature, forgetting, however, that they are hearing about God's Son, they dare to apply human contrarieties in the instance of God. TLDR, what is the argument here? Well, there's an analogy of building a house. And this is very important because we build a house by counsel, by will. And because it's by will, the house is external to us. It's, you could say, a creation of us. Whereas begetting, right? Arius said, right? The word is begotten, but God by definition is unbegotten. And Saint Athanasius responds that with, but by that logic, our sons shall not be consubstantial with us, because when we beget a son, that is by nature. And so our son is consubstantial with us, because that's an action by nature. And begetting is proper to nature. And Arius himself will agree. Well, but then Arius himself have to agree, rather, although he doesn't. If the son is begotten, that's an action that's proper to nature, not will. And so Arius contradicts himself. It's an impossibility in his system for that to be possible. This is one of the most crucial arguments that St. Athanasius used against Arius. So, St. Athanasius' explanation of the doctrine of homoousios and the Trinity, many people think that the person is in the Trinity, and I explained this in my Trinity and Christology FAQ stream. You can check that out. St. Athanasius points out that the Father is the personal source of the Trinity. It's not an abstract substance. It's the substance, the nature, the divine nature is not an abstract, impersonal substance, but it's the substance of the Father. So the deity is defined by the personhood of the Father. That's how we have one God. Thus, the persons don't merely share the essence, but they possess the fullness of the Father's essence. They possess everything the Father has because they share the same essence. But we can distinguish them because of their hypostatic properties, something that we will be talking about in the next part. The essence is one and is of the Father. Only the Father could be said to be the one true God, since all divinity is from him. John 14:28 says, the Father is greater than I, says Jesus. But this greatness is not on the level of ousia, but it's on the level of hierarchy. It's on the level of person. So the Father is greater than the Son and the Spirit, but not on the level of, again, essence. He's not superior to them by essence. He's superior to them by rank, by basically person, you could say. The persons are consubstantial, and therefore they also share the same faculties of nature. So the Trinity has one will, one energy, one mind, so on and so forth. They don't have three minds or three wills or three energies that somehow by love unite themselves to the will of the Father. But rather, the will that the Son has and the Holy Spirit has is the will of the Father. That's why the Son says, I'm not here to do my will, because for my will indicates his human will. But rather, I am here to do the will of my Father. The will of the Father. And he already did that all the time before he was incarnated anyways. And even after the incarnation, his human will freely chose to do that. So his human will was not subordinated. And I'm kind of teasing this out because in the monothelite controversy, this is going to be very, very crucial, very, very instrumental that we understand this. Simplicity is now understood as something negatively rather than positively. So with this new understanding of simplicity, multiplicity does not violate simplicity. So distinctions does not violate unity. Therefore, there can be distinctions in the Godhead, in God, whilst the Godhead retains the simplicity. So there can be distinction between God's essence and his energies. There can be distinction between God's will and his essence. There can be a distinction between God's essence with his person. And that's the key point. Nature and person are distinct, unlike what Arius says. So therefore, because of this distinction, the supporters of homoousios as homoiousios supporters claim, and homoiousios are basically people that say that the Son is of like substance with the Father. homoousios says that the Son is of the same substance of the Father. And their argument is that they confused nature and person. So the homoousios supporters said, well, you homoousios people, the problem with you guys is that you say the Son is the same substance of the Father, but doesn't that mean that means that they're the same person too? Because they're the same substance? But that doesn't make any sense, does it? Because they're distinct. And if you apply it to human persons, well, how can all human beings have the same substance if they're all distinct with one another, right? So that argument did not stand, but this is a kind of an argument that semi-Arians used, Arians themselves used in the Arian controversy. That was finally dealt with in the Second Council, but even after the Second Council, you had various different Arian groups. This will be it for the video. Now let's summarize, so we kind of remember what we have done. We talked about the Logos Apologists and how they were instrumental in the tritheological developments in the early church, and how the character of Saint Athanasius finalized, with the help of Saint Hilary of Poitiers and many other people, on the doctrine of the Trinity. Origen and his doctrines are a fulfilled synthesis of Hellenism and Christianity, and that is precisely why he was anathematized, even if he positively influenced many saints. This is something that we realize, but that doesn't really matter. Arius, thus, is the logical conclusion of early interactions between Neoplatonism and Christianity. The anathematization of Arius and his doctrines is in some way a conclusion of the first war between Christianity and Hellenism. And in the future controversies that we're going to be seeing, right, the controversies that the Cappadocian Fathers faced, the controversies about Nestorianism, monophysitism, monothelitism, these are going to be subsequent wars with between Christianity and Hellenism. I would like to thank you all for watching this. Really appreciate you guys for coming thus far with me. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to see, I will be adding this to my playlist. If you want to share anything, if you want to make a comment, be sure to bring some insight. Maybe I have forgotten something. Maybe I have not mentioned something, or maybe I have said something wrong, and I'm free to be corrected. I don't mind that. If you want to support me monetarily, if that's what your heart desires, you can always donate to my Patreon. Feel free to do that, and I will soon, I don't know when, but I will soon add perks that could be used, and some of them will be pretty nifty, I will say. So this is the end of part 3. In part 4, we're going to be talking about the theology of the Cappadocian Fathers, and a fully explicit doctrine of the Trinity with them. Thank you all for watching so far. I will see you guys in the next video. And by the way, be sure to not miss the debate that I will be doing with Daniel Kakish and his acolyte Paul in the 16th of May on Craig Truglia's channel, which will also be uploaded on my channel, but it will be live streamed on Craig's channel. God bless you all. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.